The times, however, proved so turbulent and trust proved so undermined, with COVID confusions added to an already toxic mix of fake news, climate change complexity, vaccine vacillations and more, that having a face-to-face research forum conference last year proved impossible. Instead, we held a one-off webinar on the same day, giving an overview of the same topic, during which we promised that, all being well, the full physical conference would still go ahead in Lisbon in 2021. 6 months on, even if in some countries things seem to be finally heading in the right direction, we are still clearly a long way from all being well, which is why we're having this virtual gathering rather than getting together in Portugal, and why, rather than taking an all-day conference and simply mapping it into an online forum event, we've broken it into 3 separate but inevitably slightly overlapping sessions, each focusing on a different perspective on trust and turbulence, science and society, and how they interact and interfere with each other. Now, for this first one, as I hope you're aware, our sights are set on knowledge resistance and how best to overcome it. Now, the format is very simple, and in a few minutes, I'll introduce our keynote and panelists. But before I do any of that, this being the first of these 3 European Foundation Centre Research Forum webinars, it's only fitting we hear from their current chair, who is also director of the Department of Research and Innovation at the La Caixa Foundation, Ignacy Lopez Verdaguer, known to many of you as Nacho.
Thank you so much, Quentin, and thank you everybody for being here today, participants, speakers, and members of the Research Forum of the European Foundation Centre and other foundations. So it is really a pleasure to open this seminar. When we, as Quentin was saying, the Research Forum started to think about the subject of this conference in 2018, trust in science was already, of course, a relevant issue. But today, in the middle of the pandemic, it is more important than ever. And the epigraph, in turbulent times, we believe that nails the zeitgeist of the days that we are living. Of course, we do not pretend to take credit for having a special capacity to predict the future, but we can certainly claim that foundations awareness of the importance of the relationship between science and society, and as we say in the program for the conference, of its profound implications upon the future of humanity. And we're not the only one. Many of us were happy to see how Professor Alondra Nelson, President of the Social Science Research Council, was appointed by President Biden to the position of Deputy Director for Science and Society in the Office of Science and Technology Policy of his administration for the first time. Amid the public debate about vaccines, with society ranging from wonder by research and innovation, outstanding achievement, to mistrust to worrying degrees, society at large, we can say that for the first time has realized that, and I quote, real-world science is a different beast from the hypothesized test repeat science that we learned at the school, as columnist from The Guardian wrote recently. And of course, this is applicable not only to vaccination, vaccine hesitancy, or the situation that we are living, but to other relevant policy discussions with a strong scientific basis, as climate change, to artificial intelligence or social inequalities. So those are policy issues that will remain long after the pandemic remits. So this is why the importance of the issue, and why we foundations believe that it is an important subject to tackle. As you know, the Research Forum of the EFC, and I will be very brief, is a broad-based network of independent research funding foundations in Europe, whose mission is to understand where and how philanthropy can provide effective support to research. In order to achieve this objective, we do biannual stakeholders conference and host exploratory workshops and seminars. So we have been meeting in the last decade in Stuttgart, hosted by the Robert Bosch Stiftung, talking about talent. In Barcelona, hosted by La Caixa Foundation, about social innovation. Warsaw, Foundation for Polish Sciences, about a redefinition of excellence. Hosted by the Wellcome Trust in London, about high impact research. Volkswagen Stiftung in Hanover, about cross-national funding. And as Quentin was explaining, we were going to meet in Lisbon, and we will meet in Lisbon in 2022 to have a conference about this issue. So I would like to thank at that point the Gulbenkian Foundation for their flexibility during this whole year. We have been coming back and forth to decide finally that we were going to have this content online before we have the conference. and you will have more information about it in the last webinar of this series. So, well, trust in science is a multifaceted and complex issue. The series that we are starting today, in fact, that we started last October with the first appetizer, are focused on diagnosing the issue from philosophy to human behavior, from the digitalization of science production and communication to the public engagement in science. And I would like to thank the participation of the outstanding speakers that we have today to talk about the subject. The foundations in the Research Forum believe in science, of course, as an outstanding means to understand nature and to bring solutions to the challenges of society. But at the same time, we want to have a critical discussion on how science works and how can research and innovation be funded in the best way possible to make it properly work as a part of society, of the society that it belongs to. And basically, this is why we are here today. I invite you, though, on behalf of the Research Forum of the EFC, to take part of this debate. And thank you very much, everybody, for being here.
Now, I'm going to keep the introductions for all our speakers short, because one of the pluses of doing things online is that everybody can Google far more about each of our speakers and panelists than it would be practical for me to include. But suffice to say that, among many other things, Baroness O'Neill is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge, a former president of the British Academy and the British Philosophical Association, and much of her work has been on trust, the evidence that it's declining, and how we might counter that decline through improved communication, verification, and intelligent accountability. So, is knowledge resistance a cause of declining trust or a consequence? And either way, how practical is it to think that resistance can be overcome by rebuilding trust? Our keynote speaker, Baroness Onora O'Neill.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you all for coming. This is an unusual way to communicate, but even at my age, I have sort of learned to do it, and it's interesting. I am astonished at how timely this conference is. It couldn't be, as we've already heard, more apposite. It's such an opportune time. We have ongoing examples of public mistrust in science on a scale and with a variety that I think few of us anticipated seeing in our lifetimes, although we were aware of quite a lot of mistrust. But this is, what shall we say, a high point of misplaced trust. Consider just the vaccination issues, that all the way from vaccine hesitancy to finding faults with some of the vaccines which do not reflect the statistics and so on. You name it, there are examples all around us. However, this is a very practical set of questions, and I think it's a slightly different set of questions for different groups. One can ask, what can scientists do about this? What can public institutions like the foundation do about it? What can different sorts of public institutions do? What can and should citizens do? What should each of us do in our daily lives? And the answers might differ, I think, quite a lot. So let me leap in. We all know this is not a new set of questions. Mistrust of science is old and persistent. When I say old, I don't just mean it goes back 20 years or 40 years or a century. You can find traces of it in antiquity. And that doesn't mean that it's less urgent now. And all around us, and this is, I think, the one discouraging thing I shall say, there are institutions and individuals who have been working very hard on dealing with this, on trying to reduce the misplacing of trust. The amount and standard of science reporting in, I think, most European countries is now extraordinarily large and very good. The availability of information online is, of course, extraordinarily helpful. And when you want to look something up, you just do it. How often have I thought, I wonder whether X has written something on such and such. Wikipedia tells me just like that. And the availability of digital technologies has enabled many of us to check and also to challenge credentials and claims. So it's not I think, that the groundwork isn't available. It is, it's good, it's solid. And then I look across the world of foundations and academic institutions that I'm familiar with, all the way from the Pew Foundation through to the British Academy, through to the Royal Society. They're all engaged on this. It's not a topic that we are bringing in from the margins and trying to get people to deal with. It's very present in many minds. But the mistrust persists. And I think that is the thing that is very striking, that in spite of enormous efforts, to my knowledge across 2 or 3 decades, it goes on and on and on. Now, some of it is, of course, endemic, because it goes on not just for science, but for other areas of life. Think about the prevalence of mistrust in big business or mistrust in politicians. And you may think, oh, but in that case, it's fully justified. Well, maybe and maybe not, but I think we have to differentiate when we're talking about business and about politics too. So it's not, as it were, a transient problem. It's a long-term, intractable problem that many people with considerable energy and effort have been thinking about. And so one thinks, wouldn't it be absolutely lovely to find a simple, cheap, effective way of addressing these problems? Yes, it would, but I don't think it's likely. So let me turn to some of the underlying distinctions that are, I think, important. I'll say something a little bit about what the landscape is. People often characterize the problem that we're facing as a loss of trust. We had it and we lost it. Where is it? We need to look for it. Well, that's one way of looking at it, but I think that diagnosis makes 2 questionable assumptions. The first is that there used to be more trust in whatever it is. In this case, we're talking about science. And the second is that because it's something we've lost, what we need to do is to find it, to restore it, to get it back. Now, I just wonder whether that narrative is right. We used to have it, then we lost it, now we need to find it again. I am dubious about whether it's right. I won't say much about the question of whether there used to be more trust. It's constantly asserted that there used to be more trust, but I'm not sure that we have good evidence for that. When I took a little time, but this was some years ago, to look at the evidence, it seemed to me that the evidence was extremely patchy. There were areas where we had a bit of evidence, but trust had definitely declined. There were areas, and by the way, in the UK, this included trust in scientists, where actually it had on the whole risen. There were areas where we had very little evidence. So I have no idea whether there is a clear, let alone a uniform answer to the question, has trust declined? Have we lost trust? So the metrics seem to me highly selective and on the whole not very long-term. And the answers seem to me quite variable. There used certainly to be more trust in some things or some people or some experts. But I think that there's a great, what shall I say, a sort of wash of nostalgia. The past, yes, then people used to be trusting. Well, people lived in smaller communities. They weren't dealing with as much information. They weren't dealing with quite the same range of issues. They were in a better position, perhaps, to assess what came across their desks or up to their front doors. So I suspect we can think of past trust that is not now found, but we can also, I believe, think of great examples of past mistrust, which is not now found. Think about the history of the 20th century and the extraordinary mistrust that was created by the wars. Now, in any case, I think the last thing to be desired or to be looked for is a world in which trust is simply extended to everything. Wouldn't that be even worse than where we are now, to have a world in which everything was trusted? That would amount to blind, high-risk trust being very widespread and to people having internally contradictory beliefs about trust. Whereas what we surely want is not just more trust, but more well-placed trust and less badly placed trust. What we want is intelligent trust, but also, let us admit it, intelligent mistrust, not simply more trust and less mistrust. So I want to recast the diagnosis just a little bit. I think there may be two interconnected problems that we will need to talk about today. We need to think both about misplaced trust and about misplaced mistrust. Now, I'm not absolutely certain whether that translates neatly into every language. I've tried it in the languages I know, and I sort of manage it, but it requires a certain amount of agility. So let me talk a bit about misplaced trust first. I think that the vaccine crisis has given us some examples of misplaced trust. Misplaced trust, a simple word for it would be credulity. I believe what I'm told. For example, President Bolsonaro told people that he had some rather dubious chemical or pharmaceutical that was extremely good for dealing with COVID-19. If we had lots of misplaced trust, maybe we might say, well, I know what to do. Bolsonaro told me, I trust Bolsonaro, so I'll take whatever that chemical, which I'm not going to name, was. There have been others who have said that drinking bleach, the poison people use to make their sheets whiter, would be good for COVID. There are people who trust that. So I don't think greater credulity is at all a good idea. And that's one of the reasons why I regard that slogan, we need more trust, or we need to restore trust, as a somewhat misleading slogan. But we have other examples of trust that is misplaced, not in persons, but in truth claims and in policies. Trust, after all, doesn't only get directed to individuals. Do I trust James or Jane? It gets directed to policies and it gets directed to assertions. The objects of trust and mistrust are very, very diverse. And then we have not misplaced trust, of which there are such wonderful examples in the last few months. Do you, by the way, trust QAnon's account of the US election? It's worth a study in its own right, thinking about what claims have been made about what happened in the United States presidential election. But we have the other case, namely misplaced mistrust, where people are suspicious of something for reasons we're not sure about. So it's a case of unwarranted suspicion. And I think that one of the issues that I do not fully understand, but is quite pertinent, is why are some people much more attracted to misplaced trust and others to misplaced mistrust? So I think the misplaced trust people, on the whole, we can think of them as trusting President Bolsonaro to know what to do about COVID. But the misplaced mistrust people may be a great deal more difficult to deal with. They're not credulous. Oh, no, 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 no. Whatever you tell them, they mistrust it. If you say, but look, there's rather good evidence for this, they say, well, I don't trust that evidence. I have a relative who is what is politely called vaccine hesitant. He told me he is not going to be vaccinated. He is old enough to be entitled to be vaccinated because he lives in this country and he's in his 60s. However, he's not going to be. I had to bite my lip and when he told me this, because I was tempted to say, never mind, other people are being vaccinated and that will protect you. I didn't. I was kind. But that is the sort of situation that misplaced mistrust gets you to, where you are saying, I'm not going to do this because it might injure me, and there's virtually no evidence of that. Healthy man in his 60s. But I don't really mind about the fact that it might lead to the wider spread of infections, because I'm not doing my bit to contribute to a public health measure. So that is a case of misplaced mistrust. And there's a lot of it around. I think misplaced mistrust may at present be more of a problem for us than misplaced trust. I'll come back to why I think that might be so. But give some examples. I don't trust my doctor's diagnosis, so I won't take the medicine. I don't trust this vaccination to prevent me getting COVID. I don't trust the Minneapolis Police Department to discipline officers who misbehave. All of those. The question I want to raise is whether the approach or approaches that we take to dealing with misplaced trust and credulity need to be rather different from the approaches we take when we're dealing with misplaced mistrust, unwarranted suspicion. My guess is, and maybe Stephen Lewandowski knows quite a lot about this, I don't, but I think psychologically they are very different sets of issues, and it may be worth paying much more attention to the difference between them. Meanwhile, this is a bonanza year for all of us who are interested in trust and mistrust. There's so much of it about, people are being so public about it. They are so interested in what is going on. And what we have seen is that the measures that were taken over a long period to try to deal with it, where we have tried to, as it were, convince people rationally that here's the evidence, you just need to look at it, do not work in some cases. I'm going to stop now. I think I've just laid out a dilemma that I think is quite central at the moment. We all have glorious examples, and we'll no doubt hear more examples in the course of the morning, and I look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Baroness. Obviously, at this point, there would be thunderous applause, but you know the nature of these things, so we don't have that. I'm going to take advantage of being in the moderator's position to ask just a couple of questions, if I may. I mean, you spoke about this kind of myth of lost trust, but you also spoke about how we're at the high point of misplaced trust. So I'm guessing, putting those two together, what you're really saying is that it's more of a high point of misplaced trust awareness. We're more conscious of this going on.
We're certainly more conscious. You're absolutely right. We're much more conscious. And but I think that these historical comparisons are probably quite slippery, because if you think about the sort of world that people were living in a century ago, a very much higher proportion of the people with whom they had contact would be people with whom they had repeated ongoing contact, and they knew them. And, you know, I can just hear people from my childhood saying, oh, well, old Jim, you know him, he's always telling tall stories, or whatever it was, or old so-and-so, she'll believe anything. So people knew what the other people they were interacting with were like, and they felt perhaps a bit more confident in their judgments of other people than we sometimes do.
Yes, that level of intimacy allows you to caveat. You might even have somebody who you could trust them in the morning, but you don't trust them in the afternoon because they've probably had a couple of drinks by then. And you don't have that knowledge when we're working in the remote system. I mean, I wonder, going back to what you were saying about, I mean, QAnon and the US presidential election, it brought to mind the old Lewis Carroll line from Hunting of the Snark about, if I say something 3 times, it's true. Modern technology gives more people the opportunity to say something 3 times, and there is more of us there, so that a percentage of us will then absorb that.
You are, of course, entirely right. And I should say it's not just 3 times, it's 300,000 times, if you wish. I think that, curiously, connectivity is both our friend and our enemy in getting more well-placed trust. It's obviously our friend because each of us looks things up when we don't know them. You look them up, you say that's probably a reliable source. We even have a well-known source that is available to all of us, which we can correct. If you look at Wikipedia and you discover something that is incorrect, you can get your act together and rewrite and change it. It is produced by contributors. That, by the way, is why you can't go to Wikipedia on certain very contentious issues like Israeli-Palestinian relations, because people will re-edit what you said by tomorrow morning. But you can go to them on most things because it's not that sort of confrontation. But we have extraordinary advantages that people used not to have. And we have that one great disadvantage that connectivity has multiplied, expanded in a way that is very difficult for us to assess. My own personal view is that the reason connectivity isn't helpful for some purposes is that we permit a great deal of anonymous contribution and editing of material online, so that you do not know that that nice little message you have just seen has actually been provided to millions of people. You do not know who provided it. You do not know who paid for the user data that enabled it to be distributed like that. So I think that one thing we might ask is, what is the role of anonymity in enabling the spreading of rumor and misinformation? And I think that anonymity plus connectivity is one of the poisons.
And gets in the way of intelligent accountability, because you can't have anybody accountable because you don't know what the source is. And you mentioned
who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not just the message, of course, these days, it's the picture, because there's incredible abilities digitally to create images that never happened, even videos of things that never happened. And we tend to believe what we see, and we have to then involved in a very higher level function to go, I can see this picture, I can see this text, it seems to be from an attributable source, however, I need to go and check it. And whereas you and I might go and check with Wikipedia, other people will go and check with their own sources and their own sources of news, which might confirm it, because back to say something 3 times.
Quite possible. And as you say, most of us are not going to spot that a deep fake is a fake.
I mean, one example that comes to mind for me was I was writing an article recently about somebody written about the plight of the American honeybee. Stick with me, this will get relevant, I hope. And they had a big quote from Einstein saying that if the bee disappears off the face of the earth, mankind would be extinct in within 5 years. And I went and looked it up online, and you can find it dozens of times, and you can find it there. But it turned out, it seems, I went and checked, and it seems to have originated in a protest by French beekeepers to the European Parliament in the 1980s, and somebody just made it up. But because it sounds plausible, and people think, why would somebody make that up? It keeps getting repeated and repeated and repeated, and it's now become almost accepted as a truth. And that's another danger, isn't it? That simple repetition becomes enough.
No, I think that one thing that would be very salutary is if we had a little number indicating how many times this has been posted. Now, I hesitate here because, of course, some people will say, oh, well, if it's quite so popular, it's probably true. Mm-hmm. Whereas I'm thinking the reverse. If it's quite so much repeated, probably someone has an interest in repeating it.
And also because the truth is often complicated and nuanced, and the fiction is often simple, and the loose ends are nicely tied up, and maybe there's a happy ending. So we're attracted to the fiction over the truth.
Yes, you're right.
So do we perhaps then need to not think about how to build back trust in this way, but to accept that misinformation has always been with us, and how we deal with it? There's that line from Jonathan Swift 300 years ago, falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. We need to maybe find ways to give truth better running shoes.
I do feel we would be better off getting rid of those metaphors of rebuilding or restoring or regaining trust. Two reasons. First, that we don't want blanket trust. We want discriminating, intelligent trust. Secondly, even to call it rebuilding assumes that we know a bit more about the past than actually we do know. And I don't know if you've ever tried to look at evidence about levels of trust in the not so recent past. Nowadays, we of course have a lot of different polling companies, and one can say things about the sort of evidence that can produce, but that wasn't there. You can't do the comparisons. And when people tell me that everybody was highly trusting, when they grew up in the early 20th century, I sometimes wonder, was it really like that? Mm. Did people really trust one another that much, or was it just different trust?
Yes, and in trying to deal with misinformation, we're creating misinformation by eulogizing a golden age that never actually existed. We've got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, and if you don't mind, Baroness, I'll try and put just two of them to you. Really interesting talk, says Carla Carbonelli. Not knowing what we should trust might be the most scary thing now for people, more when health is the issue. How do you fix this? I'm sorry, that's an impossible question to answer, but I'm putting it to you anyway.
How do you think we should do what?
How should you fix this situation where not knowing who and what we should trust?
Well, this is pretty standard in the human condition, isn't it? Not knowing whom to trust. And what, on the whole, we do is to proceed with caution, to ask some questions, not to, as it were, bet our entire life savings on one or another set of claims. So we all know how to be cautious, how to be careful. And I think it is an unhelpful form of nostalgia to think what I need to know is whom to trust, what to trust, then I just trust them and I don't have to do any more thinking. Life's not like that.
Yes, and also it's putting the thing back, isn't it? Because in order to know who to trust and what to trust, you're having to trust someone or something to tell you who to trust and what to trust. And how do you know that? It's a recursive. One more question. Somebody said, what role does education play in trust or understanding of complex societal dynamics?
Well, education is pretty key even for quite mundane, everyday sorts of trust and mistrust, that people can understanding a claim seems to me often what education is most essential for, that if you don't understand what something means, then you are like somebody who is putting on the blindfold and throwing the dart. Maybe you hit the target, probably you don't.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. We've got just one little comment coming from Cornelia Soapbeer. She was saying about the Einstein story. She's got another one to add. No, the Inuit do not have 40 or 50 words for snow. That's another one that persists. Baroness and Onora Neil, thank you for that. I know you're going to stay with us for a bit, but you're not here for the whole thing.
Yes.
So thank you
very much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And I'd be astounded if a good few of you haven't also got additional questions or suggestions. We've had a few in there, so please do keep them coming in via the chat box, and I'll put them, if not to the Baroness, then to the panel as well. And who are that panel, I hear you ask, or I would hear you ask if that wasn't technically impossible with Zoom? Well, we're going to get a short presentation from each of them, just so they can give you an idea of where they're coming from. And staying on our philosophical axis, we're going to begin with Åsa Wikforss, Professor of Theoretical Philosophy at Stockholm University. Åsa, who regular viewers of EFC Research Forum webinars will recall, also spoke at the one-off overview webinar back in October, currently leads the huge interdisciplinary research program, Knowledge Resistance, Causes, Consequences and Cures, funded by the Swedish Foundation for Humanities and Social Science. She's also becoming quite the regular on Swedish TV and radio, following the popular success of her book, Alternative Facts on Knowledge and Its Enemies, which may also explain why the official title of this webinar is On Knowledge and Its Enemies, Resisting the Evidence. Professor Åsa Wikforss.
Thank you. Very, very happy to be here. Oh, I should give my talk now? Is that the idea? Okay. Thank you so much. I thought I was waiting for the others to be introduced. Let me share my talk then. 1 second. Yes, indeed. I thought I would start doing this sort of philosophical cleaning job that philosophers like to do and ask this basic question about what we're even talking about here. What is knowledge resistance? I think that will be a useful exercise for our discussions. And like Quentin said, I do lead this large research program on this topic, and we have, it's cross-disciplinary. We have political scientists, psychologists, media communication scientists, and philosophers. And I hope this little presentation will explain to you why you need all these different people looking at these questions. So first, when we talk about science denial, it's sort of important to distinguish two very basic kinds of science denial. There are, of course, the people who go around denying science, but who actually believe in the scientific conclusions. It's just that they think they are rather inconvenient truths, as it has been said. These are people who, for whatever reasons, they may be you own an oil and coal company and you don't really like the conclusions of the science. So you go around denying it. Then, of course, there is the other kind of science denial situation where someone generally doubts the conclusion of science. And it's the second one that's of relevance to us today. That's where the knowledge resistance kicks in. But of course, they are connected because people who belong to the first kind of science denial group tend to try to reinforce the other kind of science denial by spreading disinformation or indeed using the method of doubt that's been studied quite carefully when it comes to climate and the tobacco industry, where you just try to get people to not trust the scientists. That's a very effective propaganda strategy. But the focus here will be on the second kind of science denial because we're interested in why people don't believe the conclusions of science, right? Another point of clarification that's useful, I think, is that you can distinguish between different kinds of science deniers. The most extreme being those who don't accept the scientific method, right? So they don't trust the conclusions of science because they don't trust science as a whole, as a scientific method. They think there are other ways of finding out. Now, typically this kind of denial pops up in the context of evolution, right? Because there is the idea there that there is another way of finding out about the history of the Earth through religion and revelations. So in the end, you have a situation where you have the scientific method that's pitted against another way, suggested another way of finding out how things are. That I think is sometimes, like when it comes to evolution, a real issue. But it's also not really the issue that's going on with a lot of science denial that we're talking about here today, because what's typical of people who believe, for example, that the global warming is not caused by carbon dioxide emissions and so on, they claim themselves to be very scientifically knowledgeable and scientifically committed. They just think the evidence is not good enough and so on. That's not really where the fault line lies with a lot of these issues, not with vaccines either. So I'm also going to put this aside now, although that is a debate one can have as well. And so I will focus on knowledge resistance, which then is precisely this, that you do not believe the conclusions of science. You think scientific method is fine, but you do not believe the conclusions of science. Usually it's a particular, I mean, no one is sort of knowledge resistant to all science. It's typically it's certain kinds of scientific claims, and I'll get back to that in a second. Now, what is knowledge resistance then? Well, when you look around in sort of popular literature, there's also the term fact resistance. I think knowledge resistance is better for various reasons, because it really is about not just resisting facts. We can all do that because tons of facts we as human beings will never ever be able to have knowledge about. But here what is going on is resisting available knowledge, something that you could know. So a common definition of this is this claim that it's about the tendency to believe what you want to believe rather than what you have good reasons to believe. And that sort of works as a rough and ready definition, but philosophically it's a bit, it's tricky and not entirely happy formulation, because it suggests that we can believe what we want to believe, and we can't. We can't intentionally decide to believe something. Extraordinarily difficult to do that psychologically. So I'm looking out the window here in Sweden today. It's sunny. I could not get myself to believe that it's raining, how much I tried. I can't get myself to believe that coronavirus is still, that it's not around anymore. I can't get myself to believe these things. So it's not as if you can, through desire, just sort of willfully believe certain things. That's not really what's going on. But it does have, knowledge resistance does have to do with how desires interferes in our reasoning, but not in this kind of intentional way. It's more indirect, it's more complicated. So one way to think about knowledge resistance, which I really think is the best way to think about it then, is as some kind of psychological mechanisms that come in the way of the evidence that is available to you. And I will talk a bit about how this can be unpacked. But let's just first note that there are different kinds of evidence, and that's very important to be clear on. In philosophy, there's a very fundamental distinction between, first of all, experiential evidence. That is evidence that we get through our senses, what we see, smell, feel. That kind of evidence, of course, is extraordinarily important for our everyday knowledge. That's how we orient ourselves in the world. But when it comes to knowledge of science, for most of us, and knowledge of the larger society or geography or history or what have you, that knowledge you do not get directly through your senses, but you get it through sources of various sorts. And that's why philosophers say that another very important kind of knowledge for human beings, and this is a thing for humans, is this testimonial knowledge. Because we have language that it can be used to transmit knowledge from individual to individual and from generation to generation. We have this knowledge spread and accumulation in a way that no other species has. And when it comes to knowledge resistance, it's rather hard to find it in the case of experiential evidence. I mean, there's some psychological experiments there where people sort of refuse to see what's in front of their eyes and so on. But it's much harder to do. And that has to do, of course, with the sort of immediacy of sensory evidence and the sort of compelling nature of it. This is why it's really hard for me to believe that it's raining now when there are blue skies outside. So when it comes to knowledge resistance, most of the evidence resistance is about resisting evidence that's testimonial in nature. And that's why trust comes in. Because, of course, if I'm going to get knowledge from someone else, I have to trust that this person is reliable. Otherwise, I won't believe what's being said, or what their book says, or the newspaper, or the TV. So trust comes in because testimonial knowledge plays such a central role in human life. And I won't try to quantify, but I would venture that almost everything we know through testimony, at least when it comes to these larger issues, and very little of it we know from direct evidence. So trust comes in right here at the level of testimonial evidence. Now, then next question is, what explains the resistance to evidence? Oops, I think I missed one. Yes. So a very important psychological mechanism that psychologists and political scientists have studied is what's called motivated reasoning. And that's this defined as this tendency of individuals to conform their assessment of information to some truth-independent goal. That's a fancy way of saying that you don't believe in accordance with the evidence, but in accordance with some other goal that you have. And a common one that's been studied a lot the last few years for obvious reasons is what's called politically motivated reasoning. And politically motivated reasoning, there the goal that drives your reasoning is what's called identity protection. That is to say, it's a case where a belief, say, about vaccines or about gun control or about immigration or crime or global warming becomes central to the group that you belong to, the cultural, ideological sort of group that's yours. This belief becomes a mark of identity. So if you want to stick with this group and be liked by them, you better stick with the belief. So when evidence comes in from the outside that this belief is not well grounded, you feel a threat, an identity threat. And again, not intentionally, this are sort of psychological mechanisms that kicking the motivated reasoning, quite unconscious, kicks in and skews the evidence so that you don't take it in and believe in accordance with what's available to you. And Dan Kahan is one of the researchers, have done quite a few nice experiments on this, but there's a ton of stuff out there like that. And Kahan's suggestion is that this explains this very contemporary phenomenon of belief polarization, where you have sharp division if factual beliefs along partisan lines. And he thinks the explanation of that is motivated reasoning. Oops, there we go. Now, motivated reasoning is an irrational process. It's a desire interfering. Here is your reasoning going along, and there, bam, comes desire and skews it and makes you not end up believing what's true. So that's an irrational process. But, and here's the real challenge, both experimentally and real life, not all evidence resistance is irrational. So if we want to figure out what to do about evidence resistance, it's really important to know whether it's coming from a source of irrationality of this sort, like motivated reasoning, or whether it's rational, because the counteracting of the knowledge resistance will be very different depending on what the problem is. So here are two cases where it's actually rational, and by rational then I mean given what you believe and what you have in your system, it's in accordance with these beliefs. This is a sort of subjective rationality notion that we need here. So here are two cases where it is rational for the individual to dismiss the evidence. The evidence here then in support of a statement S, such as vaccines are safe, measles vaccines are safe. First case is where the person has prior reasons or believes not to believe the statement. So if I've been fed a lot of information that vaccines are unsafe, then some evidence comes in saying it's safe, I have every reason to think that that evidence can't possibly be right, given what I already believe. The other situation then, of course, is the case where you have reasons to mistrust the source. So why should you take in this evidence if this source is not trustworthy? Let me say two words about both of these. First, the role of background beliefs. So yes, so the point then is that depending on what I've already been fed, it may actually be irrational for me to dismiss the evidence. I've had such overwhelming information already telling me that measles vaccines are not safe. When some evidence comes in here, the most reasonable conclusion is that that evidence must be off. This is a standard way of reasoning properly. And then there is an observation that many people have made, which is that political identities in this day and age, and I will get back to why in a second, co-vary with prior beliefs. So that different political groups have different prior beliefs. And if that's the case, you will get belief polarization without motivated reasoning, without irrationality of that sort. Let me then just finally say two words about trust in this context too. The situation we have, so it's hard indeed to quantify whether trust was higher before or lower now, and partly because we have very little figures on how high trust was before. What we do know today is this phenomenon of politically polarized trust. And this we see, I mean, you think might be that just in the US, but it's not. That is to say, how much you trust certain sources will depend on your political background. So in Sweden, for example, there's a lot of data showing how much you trust public service, which is a reliable source of information, is completely correlated with what party you vote for. The further to the right you are, the less you trust public service. The same is how much you trust science and so on. It's politically polarized. Now, if you have that situation, politically polarized trust, in combination with highly partisan and unreliable sources. I mean, remember, we have a high choice information environment. This is our challenge, right? We have so much choice. And now we get the polarization in the trust, and we also get this highly partisan and unreliable sources. And as a result, you will get belief polarization, even without motivated reasoning. And this, of course, is the main challenge that we were talking about today. What do you do when you get politically polarized trust and in combination with politically polarized sources that are where some are highly unreliable and highly partisan? This I think is the biggest challenge for us today, and it's a new challenge because it comes with the high choice information environment. And then, of course, again, like I said, once you get this difference in trust, you get difference in background beliefs, and then you get difference in how you judge the evidence that's coming in. The ignorance will reinforce itself. Knowledge will also reinforce itself, but sadly ignorance will too. And we get into bad circles and good circles, and we increase the disagreement, and it's increasingly difficult to overcome it. So I will just end there, and these are my collaborators from the other disciplines, the PIs. We have about 30 researchers involved, but these are the PIs. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Åsa, and I'm sure there'll be questions for you. If you want to respond to some of that, send those questions and comments in now via the little box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will get to as many of them as we can after we hear from our other two panelists, the first of whom is Stephan Lewandowski, Chair of Cognitive Psychology at Bristol University's School of Experimental Psychology. Stephan's been investigating the strategies and vocabularies people use to be more persuasive about misleading information, whether to counter its fallacies or to convince others that it may be true. He's also been looking into the links between climate change deniers and vaccine skeptics, but I'm not sure how much he's willing to say about that because apparently the data is still coming in. We'll find out in a minute, though, from Professor Stephan Lewandowski.
Okay, well, thank you. It's great to be here because I've been changing my talk in response to everybody else as I'm going through and listening to Onora's and Åsa's wonderful presentation. So I've decided to talk about distrust of scientific findings in the context that everybody has mentioned, namely the COVID-19 pandemics. And then I'm going to link it back to more general aspects of why people distrust science and what might happen in the future in response to that. So the World Health Organization has referred to the fallout from COVID as an infodemic of misinformation. And indeed, there's a lot of evidence that the pandemic has elicited a large number of conspiracy theories and other types of misinformation. Now, I think it's very important to understand that is unsurprising to anyone who has studied misinformation, conspiracy theories, and pandemics, because a pandemic is a prime example of a situation that is undermining people's sense of control. It is making people fearful. They feel they have lost control of their lives. And whenever that happens, a certain number of people will resort to conspiracy theories, as indeed happened a little over 100 years ago during a Russian cholera epidemic, which was blamed on doctors who were then chased down the street. Now, 130 years later, similar things happened in Holland, where rioters attacked a hospital in their frustration over COVID and triggered by misinformation and a conspiracy theory that it all might just be a hoax. And so for me, as a cognitive scientist who studies these issues, it's unsurprising that in the UK, for example, up to 10% of the population seem to believe that COVID-19 is a Chinese bioweapon. And of course, this links back to what Onora was talking about earlier, that, I mean, to hold that opinion, you have to do two things. You've got to mistrust medical research findings, and you have to trust some random guy on Twitter. So there is this odd coexistence of intense skepticism combined with gullibility that characterizes people who believe in conspiracy theories, because they'll reject anything an expert says while accepting a random tweet. And what I'll turn to in a moment is to understand some of the variables that drive this skepticism of official sources. Now, these conspiracy theories and belief in that is not without consequences for a society. People who believe in conspiracies are less likely to be vaccinated, less likely to adhere to social distancing guidelines. People who believe that 5G broadband is causing COVID are willing to endorse violence. And in fact, last year in the UK, broadband installations were attacked by arsonists for quite some time. Now that's the problem that we're facing, hence the turbulent times that we're living in, and the importance to look at scientific trust or trust in science. But here's the thing, that's only part of the story. The epidemic, the pandemic, has also led to an increase, a measurable increase in trust in scientists in many countries. Here I'm just reporting some data from the UK from about a year ago, where 2/3 of respondents said that they are now more likely to listen to expert advice than they had been before the pandemic started. Similar data from Germany show a tripling of trust in scientists in the first half of 2020. Data from the US are similar. So there is a notable increase in the trust of scientists in the population overall. In fact, if you look at data from even more recently, just earlier this year, you find that between November and January, trust in vaccines and positive attitudes towards COVID-19 vaccines have increased dramatically. In the UK by 20 percentage points, but in Sweden by 21, Spain 18. I mean, there was a huge increase in trust in the COVID-19 vaccinations. And notwithstanding all the problematic issues surrounding AstraZeneca side effects and all that, the most recent data I've seen from Denmark suggests that this trust is continuing to be very high overall, with the exception of that specific vaccine. So we have a bifurcation, a dramatic bifurcation between increasing trust in science, arguably for many people in our Western societies, accompanied by a fairly substantial number of people who do not trust scientists, but instead resort to conspiracy theories. And by the way, just as a general heuristic, when people reject science, they almost invariably accept instead some conspiracy theory or other. Even if they say they don't, just listen to them for 5 minutes and you'll find out. So what I want to focus on now is to try and understand why some people reject science. Now, sometimes it's very easy to explain, because if something is a threat to your lifestyle, then maybe you don't want to know about it. If you're a smoker and somebody tells you it could kill you, then maybe you don't want to believe that. If you love driving fast cars and flying around the world, then maybe you don't want to hear that this is causing climate change, and so on. So sometimes it is easy to understand. But at other times it isn't. And I want to start out by showing you how important in all of this political ideology or worldview is. In this particular case, I'm showing you a graph that illustrates the strength of the relationship I observed in one of my studies between people's endorsement of free market economics and their attitudes towards climate change. And what you can see here basically is that the more people are in favor of free market economics, the less likely they are to accept climate change. Now, that's easy to understand. As I already said, the more you like free markets that shouldn't be interfered with, the harder it is to accept that you might have to regulate aviation or put a price on carbon. So that's easy to understand. The fact that worldview is involved in people's response to COVID is also quite understandable, because the response to COVID, like the response to climate change, involves an interference in business as usual and your personal freedom. Wearing a mask and staying at home is an interference by the government in your personal freedom. So conservatives, especially in the United States, are naturally reluctant to accept that invasion of their freedom with measurable consequences. Because if you look at voting records in the United States, they're related to the fatalities from COVID, and the more counties voted for Trump, all other variables being equal, the less they complied with social distancing, with precisely the effects you would explain. And very recently, these data are from the 16th of April, a week ago. We see a similar division of worldview in the pattern of vaccinations in the United States. What I'm showing you on the left is vaccine hesitancy as a function of votes for Trump. The redder, the more Trump, the bluer, the more Biden. And it's a striking relationship across the states, how the voting share for Trump, as that goes up, vaccine hesitancy also rises. On the right, it flips around, but it's the same effect because what we're measuring is the share of people already vaccinated. So guess what? The less people trust vaccines, the less they get vaccinated. And it can be explained by vote share for Donald Trump. Now, again, climate change and COVID social distancing can be explained fairly easily by just thinking about what conservatives cherish, which is free markets and freedom. But the vaccinations, where does that come from? At first glance, that's puzzling. Why are vaccinations a problem to Republicans? Indeed, why is it the case that conservatism always pops up as a predictor of the rejection of science, even when it comes to things like GMO and nuclear power? There is data to suggest that Republicans in America trust scientists less, even on nuclear power, than Democrats do. So that then, to me, became a fascinating question. You know, what is it about conservatism that predisposes people towards rejection of science, even when it does not interfere with their business models? Or flip the question around, what is it about science that predisposes conservatives to reject it? So what has science done? What awful thing have we done? Well, actually, we've done stuff. What we have done over the last 300 years, if you really take a big picture, is that science has taken human beings from being the crown of creation to relegating us to some species on a rock somewhere near some average planet in some average galaxy. Oh, that's quite a decline in status. This may challenge people's religious beliefs and the belief that humans are special, both of which are known to be associated with conservatism. So perhaps there is something inherent in science that is challenging to conservatives. And it gets worse. If you think about the norms of science, this goes back to Merton's work in the 1940s. It was theoretical at the time, but since then it's been confirmed by survey research with scientists, and we as a community tend to endorse these norms even now. One of the norms is disinterestedness. We tend to do research for the benefit of science rather than personal gain. Now, I'm not saying everybody does, but a lot of scientists at universities feel that way. We also feel that the results of our research are a common property of the scientific community. And hey, that norm is called communism. That's not a good label to use when you're then trying to convince conservatives. But nonetheless, it's out there, that's what the norms are called. Universalism, our knowledge transcends boundaries. I mean, science is international. Even after Brexit, the UK is still part of the ERC and Horizon Europe. Now, those norms, if you think about it, are not readily reconciled with conservative values. I mean, the universalism opposes nationalism, which tends to be correlated with conservatism. Not identical, but correlated. Disinterestedness is opposing the crucial profit motive of libertarians, and it goes on. So perhaps then there is a deep conflict between science and conservatism that goes beyond the just convenience or inconvenience of having to pay taxes because of climate change. Well, I conducted 2 studies recently that looked at this. I'm going to report just one of them because I don't have time to get into both. Basically, I got a whole bunch of Americans, representative samples, And I asked them about scientific facts, in this particular case, climate change and vaccinations. There was another one I don't have time to talk about. And then I looked at a whole bunch of predictors that measured conservatism or related concepts and the norms of science. So in other words, I got people's attitudes towards the norms of science while also measuring their conservatism and aspects of conservatism, such as social dominance orientation, which is about a society having to have a hierarchical structure that tends to be a very strong predictor, for example, of climate change denial. So here are some of the questions that I asked. This is going back to the norms I've already explained. People could either agree with this or disagree with this. And I then looked at how much their agreement related to their attitudes and acceptance of scientific findings. And here are the data. It's just a bunch of numbers. I'll walk you through this in one step at a time. This number means that people's attitudes towards climate change are correlated with their attitudes towards vaccinations. We find this all the time, that if people accept one science, they tend to also accept another. So that is shown by this correlation here. I'm also now highlighting the fact that the more people endorse the norms of science, the more they also recognize that climate change exists and that vaccinations are safe and effective. So norms of science play a role in people's attitudes towards scientific facts. And yet again, we have negative correlations between indicators of conservatism and acceptance of those two scientific propositions, replicating much previous work, but nice to show this yet again. The more conservative people are, the less they'll accept climate change, and also the less they will accept vaccinations. And this is sort of the puzzle. Why might that be? Well, my tentative answer that I'm proposing here is that it is because the norms of science are incompatible with conservatism. And that's what these two numbers I'm highlighting now show. Arguably, the more conservative, the less people endorse the norms of science. The more social dominance orientation people show, the less they endorse the norms of science. I would argue that it is that deep incompatibility between conservative worldviews and the norms of science that explains why it is always conservatism that's implicated in science denial. I have yet to find left-wing science denial, even though I've been searching for it since 2012, 9 years, still haven't found it. In across lots of domains, tends to be on the right. So just a few more slides to point to the future, because I think it should concern us that there seems to be this incompatibility between conservatism and libertarianism, these highly correlated clusters of attitudes and science. Is that a necessary condition? Well, interestingly, there are some libertarian writers and authors who have argued that vaccination should be mandatory within a libertarian framework. And very interestingly, they're not appealing to the public good, because that would go against property rights. No, they're appealing to the undue harm that is caused by anti-vaxxers, which is something libertarians also don't like. Libertarians don't like to cause harm. They don't want to be told what to do, but they also don't want to cause harm. And precisely the same argument has been made about a libertarian case to control climate change, to do it through property rights. They're turning this idea of a market failure on its head. They say, well, it's not a market failure. Climate change is a failure to have markets. We need to have a market where people who own stuff, like a Pacific island, have property rights that they can defend in a court of law against the people who are causing climate change so their island disappears. Now, I personally think that's unworkable, but at least in theory, there are some thoughts along those lines. So the question then is, could there be a way forward to escape that, at the moment, seemingly inescapable correlation between conservatism and science denial? Well, to be honest, I'm a little skeptical, notwithstanding the fact that some libertarians make very creative arguments about vaccinations and climate change. And that is because when you look at the practice of libertarianism in the United States and indeed in Europe, they are opposing market-based solutions to climate change, such as carbon markets, on the one hand by saying they're not natural, but to my mind, even more importantly, they're opposing these market-based solutions because scientists are not operating under private market incentive structures. They're quite explicitly saying scientific knowledge is an attack on economic freedom because it comes from people who don't understand libertarian economics. They're operating under a different framework. In other words, it is the norms of science that even libertarians cite as being incompatible with their own worldview. And I therefore am of the belief that libertarian support for evidence-based policies will continue to elude us, and that we will continue to see these linkages between climate denial and COVID skepticism that have now been documented, where it is the same libertarian think tanks that are opposing climate action who are also arguing against social distancing and other pandemic control measures. I think there is a deep conflict there, and I'm personally skeptical whether we'll ever get out of that. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stephan. Just couldn't find my demute button there for a second. I'm going to save most of the questions for later, but one thing I want to just ask now, I was really intrigued by your data on trust in scientists increasing, but I just wondered, can we trust that data? Wouldn't those who distrust scientists be less likely to take part in the polls or to deliberately give answers that they thought the pollsters wanted to hear?
Well, yeah, but that would have been true a year ago as well. So, I mean, whatever it is that these people would or wouldn't do, I don't see how that would change with the pandemic necessarily. So that's one answer, because we're talking here about trends. And, you know, if there is an overall bias among certain people not to respond or not to participate, then I would expect that possibly to stay constant. So that's one answer. The other answer I would give is that, I mean, these are representative samples. These are people, you know, I don't know exactly how this particular poll was done, but it might have been the telephone poll where you just get a random phone call and somebody will ask you these questions over the phone. And you know, the participation rate of these and the sampling quality can be very good. And wherever we look, we find that. I mean, it's across so many countries, across so many different surveys, different survey techniques, that I'd be very surprised if that pattern was somehow just an artifact of something weird going on. I'd be very surprised.
There's lots more questions have come in for you, but we're going to save them until after we've heard from our final speaker, and that is Emilie Carafelakis. And Emilie is right up against the consequences of knowledge resistance on a daily basis, because she's lead for European research at the Vaccine Confidence Project in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So she's also working to develop, if not cures for knowledge resistance, then at least better ways to inoculate more of us against it. Final member of our panel, Emilie Carafelakis.
Great, thank you so much. Let me see if I can share my screen correctly. Great, I hope you can see that. Thank you. So I think I was going to talk a little bit more about the case of vaccination, trying to illustrate probably some of the points that have been made in the previous talks with what we've been seeing with vaccine hesitancy, confidence in vaccination in the past few years. So let me start at the very end. So let me start with how we can address confidence in vaccination address vaccine hesitancy. So we talk more and more now about vaccine hesitance, and a lot of people referring to anti-vaxxers, which is a term that I really dislike. But we it's become really high on the political agenda of the type of issues that we really need to address urgently, with good reason. But more and more what we're seeing is the type of response that are being developed are really focusing on knowledge. So a lot of what we're seeing is discourses saying, well, if people do not trust vaccination, it has to be because they don't know enough about the risks and the benefits. If they knew that vaccines were safe, if they knew that the disease they prevent were really serious, then they would obviously get the vaccine. So if we get them that knowledge, then they will obviously get vaccinated, and their confidence will increase. Their hesitancy will disappear. That is so far away from the truth. And unfortunately, we've seen these type of strategies being implemented and failing, and countries that actually have damaged confidence by trying too much to communicate what they want to communicate rather than communicate what people want to hear. And another issue is that they haven't addressed everything that was discussed in the previous talk. So they haven't really looked at the reasons for people's potential hesitancy, which aren't only about knowing about the risks and benefits, but it's about emotions, it's about trust, it's about social identity, group identity, it's about ideology, all of these concepts that were coming in the previous conversations. So what I also want to do is talk a little bit more about risk, because that is an obvious, we do acknowledge that a lot of what is happening with vaccine hesitancy at the moment is linked to risk perception. A lot of people are concerned about the risks of vaccination for themselves, for their children. You are injecting, a foreign substance into a healthy child, as soon as you start talking about children as well, your risk perception changes. So we have to acknowledge that we are talking about risk, but risk is complicated, and we do not necessarily have a very rational way of assessing risk. So we tend to think of ourselves as rational human beings. We tend to think, well, it's very nice to think that we make rational decisions, even when it comes to vaccination, and that we weigh the pros and the cons. And, I tend to do that as well. I tend to, when I have very important decisions to make, I'm going to make a list of all the pros and all the cons. Will I actually look at the numbers in each column? No. I'm going to see how I actually feel about the pros and how I feel about the cons. And even if one, weighs more than the other, actually it's about the feelings and how certain risk perceptions make you feel. And this model was developed with that in mind. So it really looks at the fact, if you look at the second column that looks at risk perception, that looks at how we perceive risks about vaccination. And what's interesting is also the fact that we often talk about risks and benefits of vaccines and people weighing the risks and benefits. But actually, in a lot of the times, the way people think about vaccines is a comparison of the risks and the risks. So what are the risks of taking a vaccines versus what are the risks of the disease that I'm potentially preventing? And there is a cognitive element to that risk analysis. So there is a cognitive assessment that people make, but there is also an effective risk assessment. So you assess the risks that you are potentially exposed to by vaccinating or not vaccinating by looking at the feelings and emotions that you have for each of these. And the way that you do that, it's influenced by all these factors that you have on the first and the third column. So on one side, you have the information that you receive. So you could be exposed to information campaigns, to materials, education campaigns, the media, whether that's social media. All of that information that you're exposed to will give you a certain perception of risks. But also it's about how you assess it. So two people might get the same information, but will come out with a different perception of the risks. And that is also due to all the modifying factors that you have on the third column, which are all the factors that were talked about in the previous conversations. So the way we perceive and assess risks is linked to how our attitudes to different, not only vaccination, but to science in general, to our identity. If we belong to certain groups, for example, believing that natural medicine is the way ahead, then we might feel more strongly against vaccination. there are certain norms as well. What are the norms of the groups that you belong to? Norms, inductive and descriptive norms, so what you should do, but also what you see others do. So we talk about these soccer moms groups, for example, on Facebook, and a lot of the conversations that are happening on social media aren't in anti-vaccination groups. They're actually in these moms groups that are linked with a specific identity, a specific, belief or really values that could just be their sons playing soccer in the weekend, why am I saying soccer? Sorry. Playing football in the weekend. It could be that. But in those groups, that's where they ask, well, actually, did you get vaccinated? Did you vaccinate your kids? And the conversations that are happening in those groups are the ones we should be concerned about. It's also about habits and barriers. So we see that, for example, when it is more difficult to access vaccines, that will also influence the way you perceive certain risks and benefits. So all of these factors really influence how we decide whether or not we want to vaccinate ourselves, whether we want to vaccinate our children. And another big factor, which we've talked about, is the role of trust. And we live in a world now, I think, people have mistrusted vaccination ever since vaccines were created. So if you go back to smallpox vaccine, you used to have, the very first anti-vaccination group at that time published a whole book on why you shouldn't trust the smallpox vaccine. And they had these propaganda posters with children having horns coming out of their heads after they had been vaccinated. So again, very much playing with people's emotions, people's perceptions of risks already at the time. But what we're seeing is the connection between risk and trust is that we live in a world now where risks have really become more universal. We're dealing with more complex technologies that are more difficult to understand, to control, and to measure. So when we're faced with these type of risks, we tend to, if we cannot ourselves understand and assess these risks, we tend to put our trust in others to do it for us. So that comes back to trust in scientists, trust in healthcare professionals. If I cannot understand it myself, I will see if somebody else who is more knowledgeable will be able to trust to do it for me. And we've done a review looking at the type of trust that are linked to vaccination. And you see the graph on the bottom left that shows that it's not only about trust in the vaccine, but it's trust about vaccine providers, trust about vaccine policymakers, governments. So it's all of these trusts that are linked and quite interrelated, and trust in information, of course, as well. There was a study that also looked at the connection between trust in science and confidence in vaccination, conducted by the Wellcome Trust a couple of years ago. And they did find that there was quite a strong connection between the two. So in countries where there was high trust in both doctors and nurses, but also in scientists, their confidence in vaccination was also higher. So there was a correlation between the two that was found. And another important point to mention is that we know that most people trust healthcare professionals when it comes to health. So if you do surveys, most of the time, if you ask them in terms of vaccination, who are the people that you trust the most, it will vary most of the time be my GP, my healthcare professional, my pediatrician, whoever is the doctor that gives the vaccine. That is the case. And in these type of surveys, you see one that was conducted in 2015 here, the results again showing just that. But what it shows as well is that the internet is, I think it's media, well, internet in general, and you have media as well, is right there at the bottom. So if you look at most surveys that are conducted, their participants tend to say that they do not trust the internet. And we've seen in a lot of countries, policymakers saying, well, look, we don't have a problem. Clearly, people trust their healthcare professionals. They don't trust the internet. So we're all good. Let's just focus on training the healthcare professionals and we'll be fine. The problem with that is that trust in the internet is quite a complex notion. It doesn't really mean anything. What does it mean to trust the internet? I mean, you don't trust the internet. You trust the people that post things on the internet. So you will trust an expert or a healthcare professional or someone who presents themselves as an expert, you will trust them if they post something on the internet. And the problem is that nowadays anyone can post anything on the internet. So anyone can become an expert of whatever they like. You can write a post about vaccination, and in a couple of seconds, it will be translated into a different language and spread across the world, saying that a doctor in Japan said that HPV vaccination causes important side effects. You shouldn't get vaccinated. That was translated in a real life scenario. That was translated in Danish and transferred back into Denmark and spread there and created concerns about HPV vaccination there. So information now is really available from anywhere, anytime. It can be produced by anyone. And what that does in terms of vaccination is that we can really group and keep our views very closeted to a specific group of beliefs. So what we tend to do then is that we will tend to belong to the groups that share our ideas. So the way we search for vaccination information, for example, is also influenced by what we already believe. So if you have concerns about side effects, the way you search and Google information about vaccines online will show you more negative results. And that's what you can see on the graph on the right, which shows why it's so difficult to reach people that are vaccine hesitant. And it's not just about putting positive information out there on the internet, because it doesn't reach these groups. You really have to work with these bubbles and understand who are the influencers. What happens there, you see the red dots are those who are hesitant, and the green who aren't. And what happens is the positive information really only reaches those with pre-existing positive beliefs about vaccination. Those with negative views do not actually even see that information. So how can we find who are the influencers that we could work with? And another point I want to make about that is the role of our own sort of role and engagement and empowerment in our own health. So many times we've talked about patient empowerment. Patients should be empowered, they should be more engaged in their care, they should make more decisions. But when it comes to vaccination, no, they should just listen to what their GPs have to say. And how many times have I heard GPs at conference say that, I had this patient that came with this amount of leaflets printed from the internet and all the things they read online. And you see this article that was published in the UK about a GP that threatened to not treat patients that look for information online. But that is the wrong way to go about it, because we have to admit that we live in a world now where patients are more empowered. They are more engaged. They have more information available, and they will go look for that information, whether we want it or not. They will go and look for information online. So what we need to do, instead of focusing on removing misinformation from social media, removing, or forcing people not to go online to look for medical information, is understand how we can better engage and train people to look for better information. And as it was said in the first session, to place their trust in the correct sources. Talking about times of, turbulent times and times of pandemics, I think it's also important to mention the role of uncertainty. And again, that comes back to risk and how our emotions and perceptions are affected when we don't know, when we think that scientists don't know. The role of uncertainty is quite crucial in pandemic and turbulent times, and it has quite a profound effect on our perceptions of vaccinations. There are 3 examples here. One of them is how emotions really triggered a strong crisis against HPV vaccination. I can talk about it more in questions if that's of interest, but that was really about the role of stress and mass psychogenic illnesses, showing how sometimes it's just about stress, and stress can really trigger potential body reactions, but also people sort of banning vaccination from different countries. But also the role of the state, which Stephan talked about, and how in times of uncertainty, very often there will be a balance between how much the state can get involved and how much of our individual liberties can be removed. So that coming back to that first graph, I think we need to think of better ways of managing all of these issues. And instead of just moving, we need to start moving beyond this knowledge deficit model of just trying to provide people with the information, but actually start listening to them and start understanding how we can work with them to find solutions and understand how they can look for better information. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilie. As we discovered there, you can say soccer, you can say football, but don't say both at the same time, or it sounds rude. Now, I've got lots of questions that I want to ask, but more importantly, we get to your questions. Quite a few of them have come in. Just one thing to the panel generally. Just before we start, anybody want to respond to something they've heard another panelist say, or indeed heard Baroness O'Neill say?
Can I ask Stephan something about science? I think that's really interesting about the norms.
Sure.
Because there are indeed all these people who are very into science, they think, like engineers and so on, that end up being climate deniers, right? Do you think they have a mistaken conception of the scientific norms, or do you think they're not really interested in science? Just curious.
Well, one of the things you said early on was that a lot of science denial is actually not denying science. It is in a sense, it is just replacing it with pseudoscience. So with the possible exception of evolution, where people just have a different belief system, climate deniers all claim to be the true scientists, right? The true Galileos. And it's just everybody else who's a climate scientist who somehow is politically motivated or something. So I think there is something very important here, which is that the authority of science is being invoked by the very people who are trying to undermine it. And so do they not understand the norms? Indeed, I don't think they do. They also don't really understand science, especially engineers. I mean, I know engineers are very clever and they do a lot of math. And yes, I have a lot of respect for the bridges they build. But they will say stuff that is completely unaware of science. I mean, they'll say things like, oh, well, science is measurement, it's not models. Well, that's completely false. It's the other way around. You can't measure anything unless you have a model. So models are, central to science. And a lot of people who deny science say things like that. That's just one example of just, they're just completely wrong, but don't know it and feel very strongly about it.
Isn't that also part of the nature of how human groups define themselves, is by saying we're different from those other people? We reinforce these things to say we're engineers, we're not scientists, and therefore scientists will also be equally dismissive of engineers.
Maybe. I'm not sure that, I don't think I was dismissive of engineers. I said I admire their bridges. It's just that they're not. Most of them are not scientists. If you become an engineer and then work as an engineer, you may in fact think that measurement is model free and that you can do real science without models, which is just, really not the case.
Okay, I'm going to start taking the audience questions. One for you, Stephan, from João Pedro from the Gulbenkian. He says, is the confrontation about science and conservatism or science versus power? The shift in the power distribution, he argues, is the key.
Wow, that's a very interesting question. What speaks against that is the vaccination issue. I mean, with climate change, I can totally see it. If the climate scientists have it right, then the people who are presently in power have to worry. Especially if you own Exxon, you better worry. So I can see it there, but for vaccinations, I don't see how, or for nuclear power, why do Republicans trust scientists less on nuclear power than Democrats? Nuclear power should be something, they should love it. Stuff that burns and glows and, pollutes. It's a dream come true. So why are they not trusting the scientists there? And that's why I think the power issue is not the full story, but I really couldn't be sure.
Trouble is, there are multiple elements to this, so there is no one simple thing that gets in there. We've only got about 15 minutes, so I'm going to ask all the panel to keep their answers relatively short, and we'll get through as many of these as we can, and maybe even a couple of my own questions as well. This one is from Jordi Valles from FLC. To everyone, what would motivate us to go beyond this bubble reality we construct with the information we select? What institutions would be interested and in the position to implement the mechanism to boost critical thinking? That's a biggie. Åsa.
Well, two questions. One is what would motivate us, right? In general, I think you're motivated when you realize the value of something, which I think, therefore, this data on the increased trust in science was during Corona is very interesting, right? Because suddenly you see the value of knowledge. It's not just some views. It's something you need to accomplish certain goals. That's one thing. When it comes to critical thinking, super large issue, but generally speaking, the problem is that you can't learn critical thinking independently. It's a domain-specific skill. So unless you already have knowledge in a certain area, you're not going to be good at critical thinking in that area. So critical thinking as some kind of generalized solution to all our problems is not going to work. We also need to get to get the knowledge out there. Schools, number one in every society, is going to be the schools.
Yeah, I mean, what we're dancing around here is ultimately, if we want to have a vaccine against knowledge resistance that works for all ages with no side effects, we are talking about increasing scientific literacy, aren't we? Absolutely. Knowledge is the basis for all critical thinking, and that's what you need to do. Absolutely. And therefore you need good schools. Okay, specific question for Emilie here from, forgive the pronunciation, Tina Stengele from the Program Director Science and Society at the Robert Bosch Stiftung. Emilie, you co-authored an article titled "The Pandemic of Social Media Panic Travels Faster Than the COVID-19 Outbreak," which argues that public health officials need to respond rapidly to online rumors with a, quote, proactive and engaging narrative that can mitigate misinformation. What does such a narrative need to look like in order to be effective?
Great. I think there's two different things. I think in terms of proactive, we need to start talking about issues as soon as they arrive, and I think even prepare the communication before we even have issues. So starting with, we've seen in some countries that have, said in previous discourses that vaccines don't have any side effects or that they're completely safe. That is already not a good way to start. So having that transparent information and acknowledging that vaccines have risks like everything else, that is really key. And when something actually comes up, when there's actually a rumor that starts spreading and you need to respond to it, I think in terms of engagement, what we meant is we need to start listening to the concerns that people have and the questions that they have, because we've seen too often that responses from politicians and public health specialists often lack empathy, and very often they will respond and even criticize. And that's why I said that I hate the term anti-vaxxers and anti-vaccination people, because it just puts the blame on people instead of understanding that it's completely normal for people to question and to have questions about vaccination. So empathy is really key, and listening to the key questions.
Yes, it's a failure to understand human psychology, isn't it? It's also about, there's a big difference between doing something through action versus doing something through action. So when the science calls for us to do, like with a vaccination, to do something that we think may have a tiny chance of leading to negative consequences, some people will choose not to do that, even though it opens up a much greater risk of having negative consequences. But it's not that we did it, and therefore the agency affects us, doesn't it, Emilie?
Yeah, that is completely true. And it comes back to the risk perception and how we perceive different risks, and the fact of taking an active risk versus a passive one that is perceived completely differently.
And this, I think, also feeds into the point that I think it was Stephan was talking about. Was it Stephan or also was talking about us as the no longer being the pinnacle of creation? But exactly, and obviously, it's a great equalizer. Rather than accepting wisdom from others and having it handed down to us so we can appreciate it in our lowly way, skepticism and mistrust puts us on an equal level. You have this knowledge, I have this disbelief. We're leveling the playing field, aren't we, Stephan?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And in a sense, that's exactly the problem, that, we no longer have gatekeepers like editors. We have a free for all by anyone, and it's a matter of just capturing people's attention. And this is something we should really talk about, because the online ecosystem is basically an attention economy. The only reason Facebook exists is so that they can sell your attention to advertisers. And that's trillions of dollars literally a year. So that's the environment we live in. Now, I would argue, given what we know about human attention, which is to be attracted to negative things and novel things, it is almost inevitable that that architecture will give rise to undue prominence of bad information. Good information doesn't attract our attention by definition, almost, because it tends not to be novel and it can't be emotionally evoking. I mean, I can't make up an emotion to attract your attention if I'm a scientist. And so we have to talk about that architecture. We got to have a conversation about how we can sort of deal with that business model and to prevent what is happening now, which is where people who really have no idea often get much more attention than scientists who actually know this stuff.
Can I add something to that? I just think that that's exactly the reason why we've seen in some studies that myth busting doesn't work, and that actually, if you're trying to bust myths about vaccination, what you end up doing is actually reinforcing that myths, because what you're doing is attracting attention very often to the negative aspect of the sentence. So if you're saying, vaccines do not cause side effects, like we've seen that there were rumors about vaccine causing this and that, what you're actually doing is reinforcing that myth in people's mind. So.
Yeah, I know where you're coming from, although I have to say the evidence for that is quite limited, and more often than not, debunking actually does work. It's not perfect, but it isn't causing harm on average. I think that's an important point to make, even though there are these exceptions occasionally when it doesn't work. You're muted.
Self-muted. We have a comment that's coming from Baroness Onora O'Neill, who is still with us. Baroness, would you maybe actually care to say? Hang on, still muted like me.
Yes, I was muted just like you, Quentin. I think it's generally very important to be as careful about the political labeling in this as we are about other things. So I wouldn't use the label conservative and libertarian to characterize the same group of people. I wouldn't use the label communist at all. I wouldn't use the label liberal and libertarian indifferently. And I suspect that getting the distinctions that are normally drawn by political philosophers into this debate would be quite helpful, because most conservatives, for example, are not libertarians. Most liberals are not libertarians. And so on and so on. Communitarians are utterly different from communists. These distinctions are reasonably clear, but they do need making.
Stephan?
Yeah, I totally agree. I completely agree. And by the way, the word communism was used to describe a norm, not people, in my talk. So that was just Merton's label for it.
It's unfortunate that the popular understanding of the term is so different.
Indeed. When it comes to libertarians and conservatives, yes, absolutely, they're distinct. And I always measure them as distinct constructs in my studies. However, it's also true that certainly in the United States, they're highly correlated. They're not the same, but they tend to go together. So if I draw a really broad categorization, I think I'm justified in putting libertarians and conservatives on one side and then have liberals on the other. I think it's certainly in the United States.
If I was working in the United States, I might get away with that. I don't think one gets away with it in Western Europe.
Yeah, indeed. And those data were American. Yes.
Okay, we've got a question that came in right at the start, and I've been saving it till right at the end because it kind of explains why we're all here. It's from hang on, I don't know who it's from, so sorry, but it says it's to Åsa, but I think I'm going to put it to all of you. Referring to the title of your research program, what are some potential cures for knowledge resistance that European foundations should look for and invest in? I think that kind of gets to the heart of the matter. So we'll start with Åsa.
Yeah, so we're just looking at starting the work now. There is surprisingly not that much work, scientific work yet on the cures. There's some. So some things that were mentioned now that are very important is indeed that certainly when you talk, you have a group of people and you're physically trying to reach them. It's incredibly important that you create a situation of respect. Because there's all sorts of experiments showing that if you try to increase their self-esteem, this group, make them feel a little bit better about themselves in various ways, they're much more willing to take in the information that you come with. So creating a situation of respect is clearly key. And that, of course, it's easier to do in a small group. How do you do that on a large scale, right? When you're trying to reach out in a large group of society. I think as a scientist or a researcher, when you try to go out and communicate science and people don't believe you, you have to remember exactly that it's not a good idea to try to be very aggressive or very looking down on people and so on, because that is not going to be a way of reaching out with your communication. It's hard to do, and it's not as if they pay back that thing by being respectful of you as a scientist or of science. So it's very, very difficult. It creates lots of anger often, but the basic ideas, and that of course is connected with trust again. You need to create a situation of respect because you want people to trust you, because you want them to believe what you're saying. So how do you do that on a larger scale? But then of course, I think the best thing, again, is what I talked about before, is, and that's not really curing, that's preventing these things from arising, and that is making sure there is a good sort of provision of knowledge in society. I mean, someone has said that citizens are not better than their institutions, and there's something to that, right? So when the schools fail, which I think they have done largely in Western Europe, because they don't believe in knowledge anymore, you have a very serious problem. So the institutions have to be functional. Now, of course, in the midst of all this, we also have the institutions, tech companies that are not interested in communicating knowledge, but in making revenue. And that huge part that they are playing, these institutions, in the midst of our old institutions, how can we make that functional? That is the challenge of today.
Okay, thank you, Åsa. Emilie.
Yes, I think I completely agree with what Åsa was saying. I would add, I think preparedness is really key, and what the current pandemic has shown us is that in a lot of countries, we're not prepared, and we haven't learned from our previous mistakes. And I think governments and public health authorities and research institutes need to learn from past mistakes in terms of communication and engagement, and knowing how to communicate even before the crisis starts is really key. And the way we do that is obviously not one-way communication, but having a two-way communication and engagement that really focuses on listening. And I would just also add, I think we haven't really talked about that, but the role of healthcare professionals is also key, not only in terms of training them on how to respond to patients and how to deal with these changes in technological communication means, but also in terms of their own hesitancy. And very often we forget that healthcare professionals are also individuals, public members, and parents, and they have their own doubts about science and vaccines that we also need to address.
Yes, interesting your point about communication as well, because it echoes something right at the start when Baroness O'Neill said about learning new ways to communicate by talking to us in Zoom. Maybe we need to learn new ways to communicate to deal with the influx of media. Baroness O'Neill, care to make a final comment on this?
Well, I'm just reading the... Yes, I am unmuted. I'm just reading the question that's come in. Do we think that the impact of the pandemic on trust and mistrust in science will lead to future investment in science and research by governments and/or public support for it? In theory, yes. in practice, the research budget in the UK has been cut in response to the investment that's had to be made in other public services, I mean, dramatically cut. And it particularly includes the investment in international research. And I think that will happen in a lot of jurisdictions because the money has been spent. And so I'm a bit pessimistic on that count. I'll finish with that comment.
Thank you. And I also like the way you took over the moderator's role there by reading the questions out as well. That question, by the way, from Dr. John H. Smith, Senior Advisor, EU.
Well, you're doing the proper moderating, Quentin.
Final word, Stephan.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I work on misinformation. I've been doing nothing else for the last God knows how long. And I find it very important not to forget that most people are reachable in a conversation that is based on respect, that debunking very often works, not always, and we have to know when it will and will not work, and that scientists are, in wherever you look, among the most trusted, if not the most trusted group of society in the West. And so we have a lot of credit in the bank and we can build on that. And so I'm not totally pessimistic.
Good. It's nice to end on a not totally pessimistic note, if not an actually fully upbeat note. So first, we have to leave it there. One thing we have learned from lockdown is that you can have too much of a good thing when it's happening via Zoom. So that is why, rather than turn the original planned EFC Research Forum conference into one big online event, we've remodeled it into 3 webinars on different days with different themes and speakers. And I should tell you that the second of those will be on the 18th of May from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Central European time. That should be 10 to 11:30 a.m. UK time. And building on what was discussed today, the theme for that is acceleration and digitalization of science production and communication. So that is May the 18th, but that is it for today. Thank you to all of you who've sent in messages saying thank you for today and thanking the speakers for being great and thanking the seminar as well. So we appreciate that. My thanks as well, and I hope yours go to our knowledgeably irresistible panel of Emilie Carafelakis, Professors also Wikforss and Stephan Lewandowski, and of course to our resident keynote Baroness Onora O'Neill. Thanks also to the team from the European Foundation Centre who put all these webinars or workshops or whatever you want to call it together. Principally their thematic networks coordinator, Julia Lombardi. Thanks also to yourselves for taking part, for being smart, for sending in some great questions and comments. If I did not get to yours, I apologize. Finally, as we've heard today, we've got a lot to do if scientists and scientific establishments are going to rebuild trust with the public, but it could be worse. Just be glad we're not one of those 12 clubs that signed up for plans for a European Super League and then had to abandon them when they realized how much most fans hated the idea. That kind of lost trust may never come back. Hope to see most of you again on May the 18th. Until then, farewell and enjoy the rest of your day.